IndyCar racing was flying high in the mid-1990s. High-profile drivers from the United States and overseas did battle in front of huge crowds, attracting big-name sponsors and major manufacturers to create a series that was capable of genuinely worrying F1. But that was all about to be blown apart following an announcement that was made just after Nigel Mansell had sensationally won the IndyCar title, having left F1 as the reigning champion. Because at the start of Mansell's second season in 1994, Indianapolis Motor Speedway boss Tony George announced that he was forming his own series, the Indy Racing League, to act as a back-to-basics alternative to the explosive and often brilliant CART series. Naturally, the Indy 500 was caught up in this, and while the full effects of what became known as the split took years to be felt, there was animosity, controversy and politics from the very beginning. IndyCar racing was divided for 12 seasons, during which time NASCAR made hay, and by the time the two open-wheel series got back together in 2008, the sport as a whole was in a very different place to where it was at the end of the last unified season in 1995. So how did it happen? Could it have been avoided? How much damage did it do? And are the effects still being felt today, 3 decades on? I'm Glenn Freeman, and I'm very excited for this special mini-series on the IndyCar Split, brought to you by Bring Back V10s. This is a story that fascinates me to this day, and I've brought two people in who are just as engrossed by it. Our very own Ed Straw, and a special guest, US racing journalist and author of the superb book Indy Split, John Oreovicz. John, thanks for joining us for this 3-part series. Good to know that after writing a book about this subject, you're not yet sick of talking about it. I've been trying to work out a way that we can start with brief opening remarks, because the opening segment of this show could go on forever. There's so much to say here. So given that that's pretty much impossible, I'm going to box all of us in at the beginning. Can you give me one word that you would use to sum up the IndyCar Split?
Well, Glenn, first, thanks for having me on and including me in this. It's a great, ambitious project. One word is hard, but ultimately I'd put it down as frustrating.
Yeah, that's. I think that's an emotion any of us who had any sort of affection, past or present, for IndyCar racing have felt about this. Ed, like me, you've always been an admirer of IndyCar racing, largely from afar. Back in the 1990s heyday and still today, what word would you choose?
Insanity. Simple.
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good one as well. Mine, is, and I may have to add some extra words to give the context here. Mine is Netflix. Like, how the hell has this not become, ideally based on John's book, how has this not become a Netflix series yet? There's all kinds of sports documentaries that are based on controversies and ridiculous things that happened that are very successful, and the stories that they are based on are not as good as this. So until that happens, we have John's Indy Split book. Yeah, over the next few weeks, we're going to have this podcast mini-series as well. There are a few good YouTube series about this as well that kind of independent guys have done too. So go looking for those. In this 3-part series, we're not going to try and cover the whole story of the split. Ultimately, that's what John's book is for. But we are going to stop off along the way to look at some key highlights or lowlights from the years that IndyCar racing was divided, most of which correspond pretty neatly with what we consider the Bring Back V10s era of F1 history. So we're going to be looking mainly at 90s and noughties here, and we're going to dive straight in and start the story in March 1994, when Indianapolis Motor Speedway president Tony George made a bombshell announcement that he would be launching his own IndyCar-style series as a rival to the CART championship that was flying high in America at the time. George said this new series was a result of him trying for 2 years to build a constructive relationship with the people running the existing championship, but he had come to the conclusion that we are going in different directions. He said he never felt he was taken seriously in meetings with CART, and while people might not take his announcement of a rival series seriously, he felt that the time for talking and positioning was over. The key aspect of his new championship, which did not have a name at this stage, was that it would be based around the Indy 500, the biggest event at US single-seater calendar. John, when Tony made this announcement, were you taking him seriously? Did you think this was going to happen?
Well, first of all, it's worth pointing out, and this kind of speaks to the attitude and skullduggery that was going on. The press release went out as the CART charter was midair on the way to Australia for the opening race of the 94 season. So that in itself is kind of a clue as to how this was all going to unfold. And truthfully, I don't think, unless you were a USAC hardliner, I don't think anybody really took it very seriously in March 1994. Obviously, they had to. And it's worth saying that Andrew Craig was in his first week on the job at that point. So this is what has dropped into Andrew Craig's lap as he attempts to take over the management of this series. As CART, you had to take it seriously because the Speedway was so important to IndyCar racing. But at the same time, in early 1994, Tony was 33, 34 years old. He wasn't respected by CART, and that's the key thing. The Speedway management, the Holman family, handed Tony the keys to the kingdom as soon as he turned 30. And I think that Tony himself now would admit that maybe he wasn't ready for it. There was a generation gap in the Holman family because Tony's father had been killed, murdered by his mother's boyfriend. So you could see there are some extremely strange dynamics going on here. And Tony George, this rich kid who had AJ Foyt and other influential people saying, hey, look what they've done in NASCAR. They take charge down there. This is what you need to do here. And Tony was groomed, honestly, from the time he was a little boy to be the man in charge of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And the Speedway was in such a powerful position that it was often perceived that the Speedway ruled IndyCar racing, whereas actually it was a parent company of theirs that Tony Holman also formed, United States Auto Club, that was the sanction body. And the start of CART was based on more marketing issues. The CART owners were not, the Indianapolis 500 was very successful up through the 60s and 70s, but IndyCar racing as a whole went into a very serious decline in the 70s. It went from 30 races in the late 60s on road courses, ovals, the Pikes Peak Hill Climb, dirt ovals, to 10 or 12 oval races by the mid 70s. And this was not sustainable for the team owners. And this is the genesis of why the original 1979 split happened, which of course, those bad feelings maintained themselves for 10 or 15 years until the 94 split started.
So let's explore a bit more why George felt he needed to create this own series then to rival CART. He said he felt IndyCar racing by the 1990s was missing some American flavour, saying, I'm not opposed to foreign manufacturers and competitors, but it rubs me the wrong way that America's Premier Series has to look overseas for talent because they have a fat checkbook. He said he wanted the schedule to be built around oval tracks because they were more exciting to watch and easier to produce for TV. But at this point, he was saying he wouldn't mind some road courses or street tracks. He said he was concerned about the long-term health of IndyCar racing and how expensive it was getting. But he also said he didn't want this to become a bloodbath. He wanted to work with the CART series and added, hopefully they will work with us and participate. Ed, like me, you were admiring IndyCar racing already from afar by this point. Did you think the series was missing some American flavour, watching as an international viewer?
Yeah, certainly not from my perspective. It felt very American. But then again, I was a teenager following from the UK who'd really got into IndyCar racing through a combination of Mansell going over there and also playing the Indianapolis 500 game, which was a really good one, and taught me a bit about some of the setup challenges. So it gave me an appreciation of oval racing. But looking at some of the numbers, it was still pretty American. I'd look at Indy in, I think, 94, 18 of the 33 starters were Americans. American drivers were winning most of the races that year, albeit Alonso Jr. was basically doing all the heavy lifting there. American teams, okay, Penske chassis is British. And yeah, there was an amount of international, but I don't think a problematic amount. However, obviously there's a question of perspective. So if you're somebody steeped in the traditions of IndyCar, the sprint car roots of it, the connection to that, and you're somebody who wants things to be kind of all American and sees anything foreign as a little bit suspicious and dubious, I can understand why you'd get into that mindset, I think. But obviously, the disconnect between IndyCar racing as is and sprint racing, sprint car racing, had broken long ago technologically. So It was kind of harking back to something, because that was one of the things he wanted, more of the sprint car drivers coming through into IndyCar racing, whereas actually the more natural connection was into NASCAR, which is Jeff Gordon's the poster boy for that, I guess. So I don't think it was too un-American, but I'm interested with Tony George how big a thing this was for him, because clearly, first and foremost, it was about power and control. But John, you probably have some insight on this. I found an old interview about it when he talks about the kind of Americanness of it long before he's in charge of the Speedway and doing this. So there's clearly some genuine kind of harking back to the sprint car roots. So I'm just interested to know how much of him pushing for that is a power play and an excuse, and how much of it is kind of him being the son of a sprint car racer who raced at Indy 3 times. How much of it is kind of real passion, and how much of it is an excuse? Because it's a great easy sell for people, isn't it, to talk about this? But I've never really got a feel with Tony George how much of it was a genuine belief in that, and how much that was a flag of convenience to justify everything else that was going on.
I think it's a combination of both, Ed, just in the sense that the anti-foreign feeling, it started in the 60s when Lotus came over. And I think it continued because not only did Lotus come over and win the Indy 500 with Jim Clark in 1965, but the trajectory of the car, of the IndyCar, went very much, the rear engine revolution. And from that point on, from the mid 60s to the early 90s, which was, the where we're coming in here with CART, with the 2.6 liter engines, the turbos, that was the closest that Indy cars got to Formula One cars. There was this kind of organic convergence of the cars over this 30-year period. And the old USAC hardliners didn't like that, because the USAC racing, it faded in the 70s when they took the dirt races off the IndyCar schedule starting in 1971. That connection to the traditional path to Indianapolis, as Ed pointed out, it started to sever at that point. And by the late 70s, it was starting to become obvious. There were fewer and fewer of these sprint and midget guys that traditionally made up the majority of the Indianapolis field. As the Indy cars became more road racing based, the drivers naturally, organically became trained road racers. And this started to show, especially in the early 80s, with the prominent American drivers, when Michael Andretti and Al Unser Jr. and Bobby Rahal and Danny Sullivan and guys like that started coming up. These guys were trained road racers as opposed to guys that came up the oval path. So the guys that were coming into IndyCar racing, especially through the 80s, as the cars evolved to become more road racing hybrid cars, as more road events were added to the CART schedule, honestly, because that's what sold. They were having trouble, and it continues to this day. I mean, they were having a hard time selling oval racing to the public for Indy cars as early as the 80s. And the market, the success of CART between when it kind of took over the sanction in 1980 and 1994, when Tony started the IRL, was CART took the Indy 500 and a pretty unsuccessful group of oval races, and they turned it into a championship that was worldwide appeal. It was a very successful endeavor that had 16 races around the country, starting to travel around the world at that point. They did have international aspirations. And unfortunately, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway's reaction to how CART grew IndyCar racing, and I'm talking IndyCar racing as opposed to the Indianapolis 500, which they've always separated out. But IndyCar racing in that period between 1980 and 1993, it became very, very successful as a whole. And unfortunately, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway's reaction to that was resentment and distrust, and the feeling that, hey, you're trying to take the Indy 500 away too. And I don't think that was ever the case. All they ever want, they always, from the time that the USAC split occurred in 1979, they were always happy to let the Indy 500 left to its own devices, to the point that they even left USAC in as the sanction for the Indianapolis 500. So as you can see, it was a very complicated situation that built up over a very long time. But I think by forming the IRL, especially with the timing of it, with CART being literally at its peak coming off the Mansell Championship, the timing was horrible. And just the optics of saying, hey, why do we want to mess with this? It just didn't make sense to a lot of people.
So let's get into what CART made of all this a bit more. As John's already mentioned, this announcement came just as CART had a new CEO coming in, Andrew Craig, and he referred to this, I think it might have been in your book, John, he referred to it as his arrival present. In public, Craig said immediately that the Indy 500 was immensely important to the CART series, adding, "We value our involvement in the event." He accepted that there were differences over future direction with George, but he felt we have more common ground than things that divide us. Reflecting years later in John's Indy Split book, Craig called George's claims that foreign drivers were stealing seats from American talent an extraordinary notion. John, you spoke at length to Andrew Craig. I think he has kind of a first-person chapter at the end of the Indy Split book. How concerned do you think CART really was when the news first broke?
It's kind of hard to sift back through that, being that it's 30 years later. But again, there was this feeling of, this is very successful. They can't be serious with what they're trying to do. And then the key element was the unity among the CART teams. Once it started to become clear that Tony wasn't bluffing, that he truly intended to drop this nuclear bomb, the reaction of the CART organization was they bonded together. They said, we're going to fight this attempt to make changes to what we think is a very successful endeavor. And I'd be curious to hear Ed's perspective on how this was playing out to outside eyes, because for me, I was a guy that was, I didn't love Andrew Craig. I didn't love CART, the organization, but I saw the positive things that had happened to IndyCar racing during the time that I started watching it from the late 70s. And I thought it was great. And I just couldn't understand why they'd want to take it back to where it was in the 50s.
It was a strange time because I think it took quite a long time to really internationally take it seriously, perhaps even longer than it took CART to do it, because CART was going so well and was so enjoyable and was growing and was being talked about as a threat to Formula One. It seemed inconceivable, but obviously from a distance, or certainly at the age I was at the time, it was harder to realise kind of how deep the rifts were. And I do wonder, actually, in terms of the whole motivations of it, whether CART not taking it seriously quickly enough almost fueled it and added accelerant to the whole thing.
I can definitely believe that. And honestly, some of it was, Tony George was invited to help in the process of determining the CART leader that turned out to be Andrew Craig. And Tony's candidate was a guy called Kerry Agajanian, who his father, J.C. Agajanian, was Parnelli Jones's car owner in the 50s and 60s, a well-known figure. And this goes back to Tony and his American thing. Tony did not like the notion of a Limey being the head of IndyCar racing. And that's, here in Indiana, I have to say, we're not the most progressive part of America. It is, it's kind of a redneck region, and some of the national pride thing, it runs deep here. And it's it's kind of an unfortunate xenophobic thing, I have to say.
It's an interesting thing psychologically for someone like Tony George, because it feels like part of the reason he started to do this was he didn't feel like he was being given due respect and control and being taken seriously. So yes, he announces this. That's a very vague plan when it's announced, and the details kind of follow. And then CART's response is kind of not to take this big threat seriously, which just feels like you're taking this person who's trying to prove himself to the world, probably trying to prove himself to the Holman family, to prove that he's not just a kind of idiot son, if you like, to use the colloquialism, idiot grandson, I guess would be the better thing to put. So you almost feel like some of Tony George is also created by CART, because I think in the grand scheme of things, it's more down to the Tony George side than the Indy side that caused it, but maybe complacency from CART and realising actually perhaps we should just move a little bit, because it's the usual thing, isn't it? This whole story is full of people wanting compromises, and what they mean by compromises is, well, you come on board with us. They don't actually mean compromises, and I feel like the CART side was a bit more willing to compromise, but I wonder if they could have nipped it in the bud just by making Tony George feel like he was achieving something and give him his dues, because he'd done things like bringing NASCAR to the Brickyard, so he's making a bit of an impact. And if he could have been given a bit of a win and present something as a win, even if it didn't change much, could that have averted the whole thing?
Yeah, these hard feelings dated to, Tony came on in late 89, 90, and it was late 91 when he took his proposal to the CART board for his vision for IndyCar racing, and they basically laughed him out of the room. And as Robin Miller tells it, may he rest in peace, our friend Robin, Robin was good friends with Tony Bettenhausen. And Tony George flew back from that meeting in Houston with Tony Bettenhausen. I'm going to show those motherfuckers. And it started from there. And when they continued to disrespect him after he made his announcement in 94, I think it just continued to ramp up. I'm going to show those motherfuckers. A lot of blame to go around. But I kind of equate it to the movie A Few Good Men, where there's one guy that ordered the code red, the nuclear blast, and that was Tony George. And that was giving the IRL the green light. Say, okay, we're going to do this.
Over the rest of 1994, things were actually pretty quiet in public. CART got its ducks in a row by signing lots of multi-year contracts with races to prevent them switching to the new series, which was finally given a name in July, and that's when it became the Indy Racing League, or IRL. By the end of the year, the IRL announced its technical regulations, which would feature revised CART-style cars with less downforce to reduce speeds on ovals, but it hit a hitch when none of the chassis or engine manufacturers involved in US racing at the time would agree to build anything to the new IRL specs. So in March 1995, 1 year after the idea for the new championship was announced, the IRL revealed it would run 1995 spec CART equipment during its first season in 1996, while the rules package for 97 and beyond would be defined at a later date. Most engine manufacturers in CART still refused to get involved, but Cosworth stepped up and agreed to provide engines. The IRL also announced its first non-Indy 500 race as well, at a newly built Walt Disney World Speedway. I always enjoyed it when people call that the Mick Yard, but the CART teams said they wouldn't enter it despite a sizable prize fund being on offer. So it was all looking pretty rocky for the IRL to even get started for 1996 until the CART teams made the baffling decision to agree to sell their 1995 equipment to any teams wanting to compete in that first IRL season. John, the first time I heard about this, I said that I was baffled. There's lots of other words I could have used. Was this just the dumbest thing the CART teams could have done?
Frankly, yes. Because they were doing it for pennies on the dollar as well. But this is maybe, some of what Tony George was getting at. He claimed the costs were too high for IndyCar racing, whether it was new chassis every year, whether it was more sophisticated engines and the transition to lease packages and dedicated engine manufacturers. And so, yeah, the fact that these guys were willing to get rid of their old equipment for pennies on the dollar, it was a product of the bloat, if you will, of the CART system at that point. It kind of found its equilibrium in the early 2000s, where all of a sudden they realized it actually the key point was Adrian Fernandez winning at Motegi in 1999 and a 1997 Reynard. That was kind of the moment the balloon went on over their head that said, oh my gosh, we really don't need new cars every year. And Tony was ahead of the curve on that one. So I think you could say that he was somewhat ahead of the curve in terms of being concerned about costs. But in terms of how it enabled the IRL, it was a terrible move on the CART owners' parts.
Let's skip back a few months then, as in late 94 and into 95, there had in fact been attempts to unify the two series a year before the IRL would even host a race. Andrew Craig said that he contacted George at the end of '94 because of all the criticism the new series was getting, and they discussed if there was a way to put everything back together. Craig says that George told him, just find a solution that gets everybody out of the situation looking okay, and then he would agree to it. So Craig came up with a plan, even offering to step aside himself, but he said that over Christmas in '94, George changed his mind and decided to press ahead with the IRL. Speaking about this at the time to Racer magazine, Craig said he would rather have Tony as a partner than a rival, and that his preferred solution was still to put the two series back together. But he was also adamant that if the IRL went ahead, CART wasn't going to go away either, and it would work harder than ever to make itself into an extremely strong series. Ed, how frustrating is it to think that this all could have been resolved long before we even had two competing series on track?
Yeah, beyond frustrating, I think. It clearly should have been resolved. And there comes a point in things like this where you basically need both sides to think, right, okay, this can't go on, regardless of everything that's happened in the past, until, and this actually applies to all sorts of conflicts and problems in all sorts of arenas. You basically need the parties involved to think, right, okay, we have to find a solution, and then you sit down and do it and work out how to do it. And whether that requires whether it's 50-50 movement, one side and the other, or needs one side to move 15% and the other 85%, you find a way to do it. And it seems clear that at this stage CART were a little bit more keen to do that maybe than the Tony George side, but perhaps they'd missed their window for it as well. Maybe they could have done this a little bit earlier, but it clearly needed not to happen. And I guess there's a kind of growing feeling of, oh, actually this is going to happen, isn't it? And you start to realise what all the implications are. And all the CART teams will have been feeling what these implications are in dealing with sponsors and realising what the implications were for TV, for marketing, for everything. The consequences of breaking away from the 500. So I presume they were starting to get tangible by this point. But I guess Tony George felt that he had them on the ropes and could push on. But again, the fact that Craig was willing to stand down suggests to me that there was a willingness to compromise there, whereas again, it was kind of a Tony George. It's like, well, you come in with me, not we get it back together. That's the impression I get from this.
I mean, I think one of the things that was, you mentioned Andrew offering to step down, but the guy that Tony wanted to put in charge was Leo Mel, the longtime Goodyear guy in Formula One and worldwide racing. And the CART guys were not comfortable with Leo Mel as the commissioner. That was one sticking point. But I think that there's a documented history that, as Ed said, the CART side was clearly always the one reaching out, trying to find a solution, only to be rebuffed at the last minute, oftentimes, by the Speedway. And the best way I can describe it is, are you guys familiar with the Peanuts comic strip with Charlie Brown and Linus and Lucy and all that, and the running gag of Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown to kick it? Well, Lucy's the IRL and Charlie Brown's CART. And the IRL was constantly, dangling, all right, give us your best offer, and then pulling the football away at the last minute for CART or Charlie Brown to flop flat on their backs and figure out what to do next. I think that was a constant from 94, 95, all the way up through 2007 when things finally got resolved.
That works really well, that analogy. I feel like we're going to need to animate. We're going to need to animate that scene and put some logos on the characters. So the IRL really is getting off to a stuttering start here, but George, as well as CART saying we're not going away, George was adamant that his series was definitely not going away. He said he was going to do whatever it takes to make this work, and he was willing to battle on for 10 or 15 years if he had to, which is about what it took in the end. Yeah. Despite the obvious signs of conflict with CART, he said he wanted to maintain a good relationship with the other side and talked of the two championships not scheduling clashing races against each other to make a political statement. He believed it was possible for both sides to work in the best interests of IndyCar racing, and he also felt there were enough fans to go around for two series to survive alongside each other. He also denied he was doing this because he wanted control of IndyCar racing. He said he didn't want to run his own version of CART and that he wanted to get away from the circus atmosphere and get back to traditional racing. So, John, Tony said he didn't want control. Did you believe him?
I didn't at the time. And I finally did believe him when it actually finally came together in 2008, because he didn't want to be the front man. I think he wanted the control, but he didn't want the responsibility of the control, if that makes any sense. There's a movie called The Candidate starring Robert Redford, who just died recently. And in this movie, Robert Redford's a young, fresh-faced guy, a nobody in politics, and they put him up. The party puts him up against this crusty old traditional incumbent. And Redford's character's not expected to win, and against all odds, he does. And he turns to his manager at the end of the movie and says, well, what do we do now that we've won? And I always got the feeling that's what happened when the IRL won in 2008. It's like, okay. And that's when I think it really got hammered home that, no, Tony wasn't comfortable with running it all. I mean, he wanted the satisfaction of knowing that he was that guy. But in terms of being the guy out in front of the cameras and making the decisions and things like that, I don't think he was comfortable in that role. So yeah, I mean, if you look back, it took a long time to believe it, but I think he was speaking the truth in the 90s when he said he didn't want that. But he definitely wanted his people to be the ones in charge.
A key word you mentioned there, actually, for me is frontman. I've never met the guy, but I've seen a lot of his kind of interviews and press appearances and TV appearances. He doesn't come across as someone who's comfortable being a frontman. I don't know what he's like in private, but there's no charisma, there's no presence when he speaks. I mean, when I was putting this show together, I considered if we could drop in the odd quote from Tony along the way, and frankly, everything he said in public was so slow and boring. I didn't want to do it to the show because it would have slowed things down.
He clearly has a level of intelligence if you look at his vocabulary and things like that. But he's also, like his grandfather, Tony Holman, very shy, very soft-spoken. Tony Holman was uncomfortable as a public speaker to the point that he had to write the words, "Gentlemen, start your engines," on a piece of paper. And I think that Tony, just his personality was not conducive to being that. I mean, he had the power, he had the vision, if you will, but he didn't really have the character to pull it off, if that makes any sense.
And I guess the key thing for him as well is to save face as well, because it's not just about having the power and control, it's being seen not to lose it as well, for family reasons, because this is the Holman family crown jewels, effectively, isn't it, Indianapolis? So that has to be, that's got to be part of the kind of thing driving him to not let this go, even though it may have been better for all concerned to have done so.
The family had so much to be proud of. The way the Indianapolis 500, I mean, it was already a successful event when they took it over in 1946, 1947. But the true growth of the Indianapolis 500 occurred during the Holman era, from the late 40s to the late 60s. I mean, I think people would say it probably peaked in the late 60s when you just couldn't jam another person into the place. And they'd get 150,000 people out there for pole day qualifying. It was staggering. The 500, it was still a very, very successful entity through the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s. It carried itself on its own momentum by that point. There was definitely a sense that they did not want to lose control of what they had created with a lot of hard work and their own investment.
The things were ticking along through the first part of 1995. The IRL announced a 4-race oval schedule that would later be up to 5. CART amusingly announced a rules package for 1996 that looked a lot like the one its suppliers had rejected from the IRL previously. It also stuck 2 international events at Surfers Paradise in Australia and a new Brazilian race, either side of an IRL race at Phoenix, making it pretty much impossible for any of its teams to do that IRL event, even if they wanted to. But CART left the month of May open in its 1996 calendar, as it fully intended for its teams to compete at the Indy 500, even as an IRL event. Newman Haas team owner Carl Haas confirmed there was not even a question of boycotting Indianapolis. Then George dropped the biggest bombshell so far, and the one that truly declared this was going to be a war. it was revealed that 3/4 of the starting spots for every IRL race, including the Indy 500, would be reserved for the leading cars in the IRL standings. This meant that at Indianapolis, where 33 cars were on the grid, 25 spots would be guaranteed to IRL regulars, and any outsiders who tried to make the race, even if they were much faster than some of the locked-in cars, would all be fighting over just 8 spots in the field. As I'm sure George expected, this sent shockwaves through US racing. Mario Andretti called it ludicrous, and Bobby Rahal, who I think is really relevant here because he'd been bumped out of the Indy 500 on merit as IndyCar's reigning champion in 1993, even he called the move heavy-handed and unneeded because in his view, Indianapolis should be about no gimmies, no exceptions. Andrew Craig said it showed the IRL didn't have enough support because most successful things don't need to be forced down people's throats. Ed, what did you think of this big move from the IRL?
If you look at it purely as the Indy 500 as an event in isolation, it is absurd, and I believe I kind of agree with what the Andrettis of this world said, particularly given that one of the great things about the legend of the Indy 500 is how tough it is to qualify. You know, multi-day qualifying, the drama of Bump Day, some incredible stories.
Bump Day used to be amazing.
Yeah, exactly, and it's an achievement to qualify for Indy in that scenario. That's actually, you know, if you get in, you know, okay, you might be on row 11, but you might have had countless other drivers who couldn't get in the show. So that's a huge achievement. But obviously, this isn't just looking at that in isolation. And if you look at it purely from a Tony George and establishing the IRL perspective, I actually think it's quite a good move because, one, as he did, he could say, well, it's not a lockout. Look, they're allowed in, which obviously isn't really true because there's more than 8 kart teams. But it was a useful weapon. It's trying to incentivise kart teams, if they want to try and have a foot in both camp, to actually do a full IRL programme as well, to be one of those 25 who are guaranteed. And it's also protecting those who are committing to doing your series. And obviously, although there was a lot of assistance for those teams who are going to run in the IRL, you want to be able to say to them, well, look, you're not, if you're Buzz Colkins or whatever and you win the first race, you're not going to not qualify at Indy and have no chance of winning the title or whatever, because 20 cars and are going to turn up entered by teams who know these cars inside out and have more money and expertise, etc. So actually, from that perspective and as a tactic, a strategy, in isolation, looking at that landscape, I actually think it was a pretty good move. Horrible for the event and all part of a wider nonsense of the whole split, but purely as a weapon within that, I actually think it was quite a clever one, and it also played a role in just further creating battle lines and pushing them apart, because it's effectively a commitment to saying, right, you are with us or you're against us. You can't be half in, half out. You can't do kart and then turn up and do the 500 because it works for you. Realistically, you need to commit, and of course kart with its scheduling made that difficult as well. So battle lines are drawn, they're moving apart at this point, and I actually think, strategically, not a bad move.
Heavy-handed, I think Bobby Rahal's word is a great way of putting it. And it wasn't a move intended for the Indy 500 because the kart guys would have showed up for that. This move was made to ensure that there would be adequate participation at Walt Disney World, at Phoenix, at the other races. And it put the kart guys in a position where they had to make a decision. Are we going to, I mean, they could have gone to Disney World and Phoenix and they could have dominated and they could have taken those 25 spaces. But at the same time, I think on principle and on philosophy that they chose to stand strong and say, no, we're not going to capitulate to these demands. And unfortunately, their response was to create their own race to go head-to-head against the Indianapolis 500, which, again, that's, you know, if bringing out the 25-8 hammer is a big move, so is saying, all right, ladies and gentlemen, meet the US 500.
Yep, there's plenty of US 500 chat to come, some in this episode and some in episode 2. I am fascinated by, I did wonder when reading your book and when researching this again for this podcast, there's a little part of me that thought, do those first 2 races, as you say, mop up all the spots, and then don't do any more IRL for the rest of the season and go, good luck with your championship that's now got 6 cars in it. But I would have quite liked to see what would have happened if they did that. But in the weeks and months that followed this announcement, the IRL pushed back on the criticism of what would become known as the 25 and 8 rule for Indy. IRL executive director...
Yes, it was about inclusion, not exclusion.
Yes, exactly, because IRL executive director Jack Long said he didn't understand why people were saying the IRL were trying to exclude people, as it had invited everyone to take part in all of its races. So in theory, anyone could run the early IRL races and lock themselves into the 500. He said that rather than being exclusionary, it was an exemption based on participation and performance and was designed to reward those who compete in our series. Later in 1995... Tony George wrote an open letter in the Indianapolis Star where he said he wanted to make clear there is no lockout. He accused CART of trying to eliminate the IRL and gain control of the Indy 500 and of creating deliberate and unnecessary conflicts that the IRL had sincerely tried to avoid. Andrew Craig countered with his own open letter a week later, saying the 25 and 8 rule was a lockout in every sense of the word. And he said the actions of the Speedway were not an act of defence against some invading horde, but rather an attack against good and hard-working people and all the traditions and all that is good about the Indy 500. He said CART's sincere wish was to be racing at Indianapolis in May 1996, and he hoped for a resolution based on sensible, rational discussion. And he also, Andrew Craig called it ironic that George said he was trying to protect the future of the Indy 500 because he felt that the recent actions had the potential to achieve the opposite. And he warned that the whole sport was in grave danger of being deeply damaged at a time when its potential for growth is there for all to see. Now, obviously, we're all here because we know it did a lot of damage. But, John, that last point is really important, isn't it? We're doing this at a time when IndyCar racing is flying high. 1995 IndyCar was absolutely brilliant. What a ridiculous time to be trying to tear it apart like this.
They were definitely playing a high-stakes game of chicken. And you know, sitting there watching it, you thought, no, they can't let this happen. And I think one of, some of what sparked this letter from Tony, these conflicts, they got, I think, more upset than they should have about the scheduling of Brazil and Australia. And I think if of course, if you're making a 4 or 5 race schedule, it's not that hard. But these days, when the modern IndyCar series is issuing its schedule in September and talking about, oh my gosh, how difficult it is, to line up these tracks and television and all that, I don't think that the IRL really gave CART credit for, well, not only for what it achieved, but just for how difficult it really is to stage a full professional season-long series of races. Terrible timing because, as I said, I think that you could argue that 93 was the absolute peak, the Mansell year, just because of the magnitude of the international attention it brought in. And I mean, my recollection of that year is, long lines to get in and out of racetracks, Road America, Laguna Seca, places like that, Milwaukee, Nazareth. It was flying high. Even in 95, it really was still flying high. You still were carrying an international interest with Jacques Villeneuve, just because of the Gilles Villeneuve influence. People internationally were aware of Jacques and his relation to Formula One and Gilles. It's almost inconceivable that some type of working relationship, that they couldn't figure it out. These are rational, intelligent human beings, but ultimately, I think what put the kibosh on it all is pure emotion. Pure emotion from the Holman side of protecting their assets, and pure emotion from the CART side of not willing to be dictated to by what they perceived as a bunch of hillbillies.
In December 1995, the IRL widened the divide between the two series by announcing its 1997 rules package, which featured a completely different chassis and engine spec. This would mean any CART teams who wanted to race at Indy beyond 1996 would have to buy completely different cars to do so. Then, as John mentioned earlier, CART fired back with a bombshell of its own before Christmas, as it announced it would run its own 500-mile race on the same day as the Indy 500 in 1996, the US 500 at Michigan. Andrew Craig said in John's book that CART had to do something as teams and sponsors were getting worried about not racing on the Indy 500 weekend, and he said it kept the teams from drifting to whatever Tony had started. He added, having to run a series without the Indianapolis 500 was not something that I wanted. It was forced upon me. Having had it forced upon me, what I did was keep the series alive. The CART drivers were unanimous that they didn't want to race somewhere other than Indy that weekend, but they accepted it was a sad reality of really what was a political situation by this point. Michael Andretti perhaps summed it up best, saying, all of us hope deep down inside there is a compromise because nobody is going to win. Ed, as a fan, what did you think when you heard about the US 500?
As a race, not a great deal. It was just another CART round, which is great because CART was great, but you can try and ape elements of the weekend, and obviously they had qualifying a long way out, so they could spend ages shouting about the pole sitter and all that, but it wasn't the 500. It just wasn't. And obviously it was still a great race, but it couldn't capture what the Indy 500 had, because it has this enormous history. No matter who you've got running in the 500, it is still the 500, which is the one bit of leverage really that Tony George Ultimate had, and what a bit of leverage ultimately that proved to be. So yeah, I mean, it was from a kind of getting the popcorn out and watching the political battling and all those nonsense stories and the arguing and everything. That side of it, I guess, was fun, if it wasn't so terrible for what it actually meant. But purely as a race, no matter what, you can't create a similar race and expect it to be the Super Bowl, to slightly mix my sports up, if you see what I mean. It just isn't, no matter what you've got. So yeah, it was an interesting political move and an interesting part of the battle, but it was never going to be Indy.
So, while all the drivers were understandably expressing disappointment in early 1996 about the prospect of not being at Indianapolis, another little spat broke out between the series as Indianapolis terminated the CART series license to use the term IndyCar. George said this move was made because CART had engaged in or permitted conduct which casts IMS in an unfavourable light, and he said it was apparent the common ground on which the licence agreement was based no longer exists. He said that the decision for CART to host its own race as a direct rival to the Indy 500 makes it clear that continued use of the IndyCar mark by CART no longer makes any sense. What was weird about this, though, was that the IRL also agreed not to use the term until at least the end of 2002. Andrew Craig said he didn't know why the Indianapolis side agreed to that, and he felt it was good for CART because it made it harder for the IRL to get established than if they just started calling themselves IndyCar instead. He also pointed out, though, how really this was bad for everyone, because you now had a situation where the CART series had champ cars and there were IRL cars, and the brand IndyCar, in Craig's words, just kind of vanished. John, is that an important point, that maybe the loss of the term IndyCar entirely during this period was bad for the sport overall, regardless of which side you were on at the time?
Yes, purely because of the sheer confusion it created. If you watched the Michigan race, or if you watched CART, you saw what you thought for the past however many years was an IndyCar. But suddenly it's a champ car. And the nomenclature IndyCar, let's just take care of this right now. It was a champ car. It was the USAC, the top series that included the Indianapolis 500 up through the 70s was the USAC Championship Trail. And USAC sanctioned midget racing, sprint car racing, and champ car racing. The champ cars being the cars that raced at Indianapolis and other paved racetracks, whether oval. During the 70s, somehow, just as the cars became more specialized, as the dirt cars faded away, champ cars somewhat generically became called Indy cars. So by the time, it was the CART IndyCar World Series throughout the 80s. IndyCar was a term that was synonymous with the CART series and those cars. So now you have a point where you're not allowed to call what has been called an IndyCar an IndyCar. Suddenly it's a champ car again, which is what it used to be before it was an IndyCar. And now you're introducing something that's going to be called an IRL car. And for worse, I have to say, the term IRL car stuck, because these days people who enjoyed the CART formula, the 2.6 liter high tech turbo formula, from the start, when the IRL introduced its own cars in 1997, they were dumbed down, simple, cheap race cars. And that stigma has not gone away. Today's Indy cars, now that they're allowed to be called Indy cars again, they are derived from the IRL cars. And so, to the snobs or the purists, they'll always be IRL cars. And until there's a major overhaul, they'll never be Indy cars again. So I've just added another layer of confusion to it all. But yes, it was just weird and inexplicable that the Speedway gave up its right to use the term IndyCar for that 5-year period. And you ended up with Champ Car versus IRL. And the Champ Car terminology, it just didn't resonate the way it did in the 60s and 70s. IndyCar was a very successful way of describing it.
It's a textbook example, isn't it, of in an era where sports marketing is becoming ever more important, TV becoming ever more important, you've actually got this IndyCar word, which is actually a really good brand because it ties it to something. People know the Indy 500. They should have been solidifying what IndyCar meant from its slightly vague origins in this period, and instead they just ruined it. So, yeah, if you're trying to sell your product to people, you've got this thing you should be building into a powerhouse brand. And IndyCar today, if the right trajectory was followed, should be a very, very, very powerful sporting league brand. And it's just not. So
I don't think the Speedway truly understood the value of the word IndyCar at that point. It was all in. They're so Indy-centric. Just as long as Indy was involved, that's all that mattered to them. And I don't think they understood the power that the actual brand or phrase or vehicle, what people conceived as an IndyCar was.
I've just got to throw in, leaping forward, some of the names that were being used. There was a point I remember being at Autosport, this would have been about 2003, and the powers that be in CART were really badgering us to call it Bridgestone Presents the Champ Car World Series powered by Ford. And you're like, come on. This is ridiculous.
You couldn't even fit all that in a 70-character tweet.
Yeah, that's not a brand. It's just nonsense.
I will say, John, when you were doing that explanation of IRL cars and champ cars and all that, I'm impressed that you never quite got to the term crack wagon, which I think was created by Paul Tracy.
Paul Tracy, one of his many contributions to the sport, among them the 2002 Indy 500 winner.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in quite some detail. I think that's in episode 3. But let's finish up part 1 of the series with a look at the new era for the Indy 500. With all the big CART stars missing, we're going to talk about their race in episode 2. Former winner Arie Luyendyk was one of the biggest names to stick with Indy, but even he said it's quite different and not the competition it's been in years past because there are less people here that we have to beat. The race was won in the end by Buddy Lazier, one of several drivers with some CART experience, but not many achievements to his name prior to the event. Lazier claimed afterwards that the 1996 field would have equalled any other field in the past at Indianapolis, which is obviously nonsense, but ultimately the split wasn't his fault. I'm not going to fire shots at him, and he did say he would have liked to have everybody to race against. So to bring episode 1 to a close, John, just tell us, what was the first IRL Indy 500 like?
You can make the argument that the IRL provided opportunity to guys like Buddy Lazier and Buzz Calkins and guys that, Calkins hadn't gotten there yet, but Buddy Lazier is a classic example of a journeyman who had never finished better than 7th in a CART race, stumbling around at the back of the grid for a bunch of low-budget teams. And a team that was a low-budget team in CART that made the move to the IRL, Hemmelgarn Racing, was suddenly they were a whale. They weren't a minnow anymore. By IRL terms in 1996, a CART backmarker was a big-timer. The 96 500 was a strange race. The track had been repaved, and they were using 1995 spec CART cars with a couple modifications, and Luyendyk set the Indianapolis track record in qualifying that year. The combination of the amount of boost they were running with the Cosworth engines and Firestone tires coming in and new track. Ari ran a 239 mile an hour lap and a 237 mile an hour average, and they haven't come close to that since. So on the one hand, there's, that form of excitement was there, the high speeds. But at the same time, if you look down the entry list, 3/4 of the guys were unrecognizable. The only people that had any name value recognition were the guys that did come from the CART series. A couple of the oval track guys had some notoriety. It was a nondescript race, I would say. The drivers were told very sternly to take it easy and basically not race for the first 20 laps so that they would avoid the potential of an embarrassing early incident or accident, which turned out to be pretty prudent advice, because you can look back at the 96 Indy 500 as kind of a bland, nondescript race, whereas we'll get into the US 500 later. Lazier beat Davy Jones, another American driver who was a road racing product. He'd raced Formula 3 over in England. I guess he ran in the days of Senna in Formula 3. The field makeup was little different than it had been. There may have been slightly more American drivers or sprint car drivers than there had been in the past, but there were just as many Eliseo Salazars and Fermin Velez's in there as there were oval track guys. Lazier winning, on the one hand, it validated the IRL for giving a guy an opportunity to win the greatest race in the world. But on the other hand, it validated the CART side for saying, this guy couldn't qualify higher than 20th from one of our races, and all of a sudden he's crushing those guys. So it was an interesting double-edged sword. I think the IRL, given the lack of experience of the field, really dodged a bullet that they had a pretty clean race, really until the last corner of the last lap, where Roberto Guerrero got together with Alessandro Zampedri, and Zampedri's car got up in the fence and he hurt his legs pretty bad. But other than that, it was boring, and that's what the IRL needed from that Indy 500, and they got a popular result too, because an American guy won. So you'd have to say that on their terms, the 1996 Indy 500 was a success.
And they also lucked in a little bit in that they got a story with a winner in Lazier, who had the nasty back injury sustained at Phoenix. He was racing in a back brace. There's footage of him under the caution, sort of sticking his arm out the cockpit in the air, moving it around, just trying to relieve the pain. So there was a great kind of heroic story there as well. And really, they needed either that to happen or for one of the sprint car guys, like Tony Stewart, to win it. That would have kind of fitted in with their narrative as well. But it could have been someone really anonymous that didn't have a story. And that would have been, I think, a lot worse. And actually, looking at, I went back just to have a look at the previous year's race, because I thought, there are loads more cautions. So I thought I can remember a few silly incidents in that race, but actually the number of caution laps is almost identical compared to the previous year. So it wasn't a complete kind of farce race or something. Which
wait a year or two for that.
Exactly, yeah. And but also, although this is the first IRL Indy 500. It's also not really the first IRL Indy 500, because this is this weird little kind of, it's a post-CART IRL Indy 500 with those cars. So
it's a true one-off in that regard.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think you've used the phrase kind of a facsimile of an Indy 500, because it looked like it, because those were recognisably Indy cars, weren't they? Because they were the same cars as CART, just the previous years or older.
Five or six guys were the same guys that had been in the year before. Eddie Cheever and Lazier and Davy Jones and guys like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually have a strange fascination with the 96 Indy 500, all these weird new drivers coming. And I may be one of the few people who, when I went around the Indy Museum a few years ago, was actually quite excited to stumble across the Hamilton car of Lazier, the purple car, because it's just, it wasn't that I thought the split was a good thing, but it was interesting because there was this whole load of new drivers, just a different stories, different worlds, and suddenly it's like, who's this Scott Harrington? Oh, there's an interesting story.
But I think we can put a bow on this, especially for the UK audience, if I share the story that, in the early 90s, I was trying to break in as a journalist. I started with my first professional byline was the 93 Detroit Grand Prix kart race for Autosport. And then I covered the series for Autocar and a little bit for Autosport, just as kind of a second stringer behind Gordon Kirby. So when 96 rolls around and they've got the US 500 and they've got the Indy 500, Gordon Kirby, the beat guy, gets assigned to the US 500. And me, the flunky, I get the Indy 500. And that shows you the stature of the 96 Indy 500.
That seems a little bit harsh on you, but it also does not...
Young
does
and
not
unproven.
Okay, yeah. Well, there you go. The IRL was giving everybody opportunities,
Look at
even
that.
outside of the car. And it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that Ed would have a fascination with a race that was effectively made up of backmarkers from a more powerful series. But we're going to hit the pause button there. And when we return for episode 2, we'll be looking at what went on with CART's US 500, which couldn't have got off to a worse start.